Since Russia first invaded Ukraine in February 2022, the drone has been front and center in the development of war. Russia had one system of fighting really before it started. And initially, the Ukraine side made masterful use of the drones, which really put the Russians on their back foot. But over the course of the war, we've seen different iterations of one side gaining advantage and another side, both sides trying to figure out how all of this technology is going to weave into the new nature of war, how things are going to be fought. And we're trying to figure out, what's next. Everybody always wants to know what's next. How can we counter one set of drones while amplifying our own? And then the other side tries to counter that. And we're going to now look at, for the first time since we've been doing our show here, we actually have a drone expert to help us unpack what's really going on with some of this and where it may be going next. And I'd like to introduce to you Sam Bendet, who is the advisor for Russian studies for CNA, a group that's headquartered in Arlington, Virginia, though he's coming to us from Florida. Sam, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me. Look forward to the conversation.
I wonder if you could tell our audience a little bit about some of the things that you do and things you've been working on. I know you said you've been working on some of these things even since 2016, possibly even before that.
I'm part of a team that looks at the development of Russian military technologies, Russian military weapons and systems. We're trying to understand how and why Russia fights. And certainly we are keeping a very close eye on a daily basis what is happening in the war in Ukraine. And so on that team, I am trying to understand how Russia specifically, but also Ukraine, are using UAVs, using autonomous, unmanned, uncrewed robotic systems, as well as how they're trying to utilize artificial intelligence.
And so you've been really following this from the outset. And I just wonder if you can just kind of categorically, even before we get into some specifics here, just talk about how the presence, the ubiquitous presence of drones and anti-drone warfare have changed the nature of how wars have fought. Say even back to, I don't know, the U.S. invasion in Iraq in 2003, for example, when drones were just a tiny fraction of the process here.
So if we talked about drone warfare prior to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, what came to mind are larger, expensive platforms used by United States, used by China, used by Israel, and other major world powers. These are combat, these are drones for intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. But the vast majority of those drones were, again, were rather expensive and used in a very limited set of missions. U.S. drone dominance really came to the fore during the war on terror, when the United States had complete control and dominance of the skies. The war in Ukraine changed that formula to a very significant extent, because much of what is happening in Ukraine is at the very tactical level. So most of the fighting is taking place between, let's say, 0 to 10 or 15 or 20 kilometers from the very line of contact. And so there's a very different need for very specific systems. And that differs from some of the wars fought beforehand. For example, in 2020, Azerbaijan and Armenia fought a brief war over control of the Nagorno-Karabakh region, and Azerbaijan used a large number of Turkish, Israeli, and other drones, which performed kamikaze sort of one-way attack roles and combat missions against what was largely a stationary and unprepared Armenian defense. When Armenian forces actually brought a lot of electronic warfare and air defense systems to the front, those drones didn't perform quite as well. But that war left a lasting impression, certainly on the Russians and on other powers, because it drove home the point that a major war would probably involve a large number of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance UAVs. It would involve a large number of one-way kamikaze drones. And these wars have to have a very significant amount of counter-UAV air defense and electronic warfare technologies.
Now, I want to ask you a question, because I had studied that 2020 Azerbaijan war that you referenced there, because I thought it was, as an armor guy who's fought in armored warfare, I thought, wow, this is really going to change the nature of war. And so I thought that especially because of the proximity, I figured Russia would have been paying a lot of attention to that, and I expected them to make heavy use of that from the very beginning. But it doesn't seem like they did, and in fact, it seems like that the Ukraine side really had the earlier advantage. I wonder if you can talk a little bit, since you study the Russian side as well, what lessons they drew from the 2020 war prior to their launch of this operation.
Well, they probably drew the right lessons, and I just mentioned them prior to this clip, right? The availability of ISR UAVs, the availability of kamikaze drones, the necessity of having counter UAS, counter UAV, air defense, and electronic warfare complement. But Russians were preparing for a different type of war. They really were not anticipating how this war would unfold in the coming weeks and months after the invasion. They really thought they would take Kiev in 3 days, and they didn't really anticipate the type of Ukrainian defenses and counterattacks, as well as they failed to really prepare for the Ukrainian military that was really ready for this invasion. And so Russia had a lot of mistaken assumptions about what they would encounter in Ukraine. And that, of course, affected how they were preparing for this invasion, what kind of equipment and supplies they had with them. So, for example, they really didn't have a lot of drones in the opening days and even weeks of the war. So it took a couple of weeks to launch some of the drones that are now commonplace from the Russian side. Ukrainians were anticipating this invasion. They were ready. But a lot of these developments actually go back not just to February of 2022 when the invasion happened, but probably almost a decade back, that caused both sides to kind of rethink and analyze the role of some of the tactical UAVs. The real issue is, how do both sides learn from earlier conflicts? So when Russia facilitated the separation of Donetsk and Lugansk regions from eastern Ukraine, when Russia captured the Crimean Peninsula, and during the war in 2014, 2015 for those territories, there were a lot of very interesting technologies that were already important. So Ukrainians were flying commercial UAVs, commercial quadcopters. Ukrainians were trying to come up with ways to fly tactical drones. For Russia, this was a very quick war against what they thought was an unprepared and rather weak adversary, because Ukrainian military was not ready for the type of war it found itself in 2014 and 2015. And so UAVs played a limited but important role. And so following that conflict, a lot of Ukrainian startups, a lot of Ukrainian experts, people who were actually involved in actions against the Russian military or against pro-Russia separatists, they were the ones who formed sort of the core of much of the developments and much of the success in tactical drones that we see today. Russia fought in that conflict, but apparently some of those lessons really didn't sink very well. Just like the very public lessons from Nagorno-Karabakh war, which were publicly discussed by the Russian military establishment, Russian military expert establishment. A lot of those lessons were very public, but didn't really sink in. And again, in 2022, Russia wasn't ready for the resistance that it encountered in a very well-organized Ukrainian military and Ukrainian.
I want to tap off of that and expand on that a little bit. Something you just brought up there. So Russia had paid attention to the Nagorno-Karabakh war, and they had been talking about it in their, whether it was their public, professional journals, etc., for a couple of years before. But there's a big difference between the theory of war and then its application. And, so one of the things that we saw quickly, one of the stars of the 2020 war was the Barakar. I think it was the AN-2 drone. I may be getting the nomenclature wrong, but
the Barakar TB2 drone.
Right.
Yeah.
So that was a big star then. It was also a big star on the Ukraine side early in the war. But then after a few months, you almost never heard from it again. I wonder if you can explain how the technology changes and the ability of one side under fire to counter the other side. How does that work?
So Barakar and similar drones that are flown by United States, China, Israel, Iran, and other countries, they are relatively low-flying, slow-flying drones. So in the absence of well-established and well-organized air defense, these drones can actually do a lot of damage. And that's what we saw in the opening weeks in the opening months of the war. As soon as Russians were able to utilize air defense technologies, as soon as they were better organized, these drones were shot out of the sky. And so they were relegated to another mission set where they provide intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance and guide other targets, other assets to targets, but they remain out of range of air defense systems. United States experienced something similar just recently when the Yemeni Houthis were able to shut down several of American intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance drones over their territory. These UAVs really are not built to withstand very sophisticated or very capable air defenses. And so what we have seen in Ukraine beginning in March of 2022 and through today is a move away from very expensive standalone platforms like expensive UAVs towards mass application of very cheap and very attritable systems like one-way drones, kamikaze drones, or commercial type drones in the many, many thousands. And that is the main pattern that we're witnessing right now in Ukraine for both sides. Obviously, both Ukrainian and Russian militaries do have long-range sophisticated UAVs, but they are not used in any significant amount because of the concern for adversarial air defenses.
Now, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about air defenses, because there's a difference in probably at the beginning, and even more so, at least I would think, and this is more a question than a statement, that the air defenses are different for like anti-air, traditional anti-air against jet fighters or bombers or the like, in terms of the drone, whether you're talking about the big reconnaissance drones or the smaller quadcopters, et cetera. What is the difference in the type of air defense systems for the bigger platforms, and what have they created? What's new for the tactical drones?
So for larger drones, for more expensive drones, for fixed-wing aircraft, for helicopters and incoming missiles, most of the air defense systems operational around the world, that's what they were designed for. In other words, they were designed to identify and intercept large targets. What we're witnessing in Ukraine is a multitude, in a many, many thousands of tiny, small targets. And these large, sophisticated air defense systems were not designed for that, nor can they handle that. And so what we have seen is a development of different types of tactical short-range air defense systems that are aiming to identify and interdict those much smaller sized platforms. For Ukrainians, for example, it of course involves the use of missiles because every drone has to be shut down eventually. But it also involves the use of essentially large caliber machine guns and other short-range air defense systems to take down Russian Shahed drones, for example, or Geran drones, as they're now called. At the very tactical level, both sides are using essentially small arms. They're using machine guns and other readily available and ubiquitous technologies to identify and take down these small UAVs, which are actually proliferating rather rapidly. There's been another evolution, and this is important. There's been another important evolution here, and that is both sides are using fixed-wing reconnaissance drones to see what is happening in the adversarial rear up to 60, 70, 100 kilometers. And sometimes those drones can be out of range of electronic warfare or air defense systems. So now Ukraine is using its FPV drones, its short-range UAVs, to identify and take down Russian fixed-wing drones. And Russians are doing the same as well. So what we're witnessing right now is kind of the seesaw pattern that you have identified early on, that as soon as one side gains an advantage or has a technology that works, the other side learns to copy that or maybe to counter it. And so the advantage for either side doesn't last very long in Ukraine when it comes to the use and application of different types of UAV technologies, as well as the use of electronic warfare and jamming. Now,
I want to show. We have a couple of really interesting videos to show. First of all, this is a guy named Matt Van Dyke, who we had on our show last December. He was an American who had gone over to initially to help train Ukraine soldiers, but got enamored with their position and really just got really affectionate with a lot of them. So he decided to go fight for them. So after he fought on the front lines, he came back on our show to explain what it was like fighting on the front lines. And man, did he have an eye-opening thing to talk about the drones. Watch this first.
The drone warfare has made it very difficult to leave a trench dugout on either side of the war. The Russians have largely caught up to us and maybe surpassed us in some ways with drone warfare. Do you hear the noise? It sounds like a mosquito in your ear, and that's a drone coming. So at least you can hear them most of the time, and they're being used to drop grenades. It certainly has changed war. I mean, there's no real way to advance when you can't step out of the dugout even to take a leak without risk of dying from a grenade coming from the sky.
And man, he talked to us a little bit afterwards about it was even much worse than he said. And here's someone from just a few days ago, actually, and this is really remarkable. To your point, here they're trying to shoot him down with a machine gun, and then the guy just throws his weapon at it just to knock it down. That is, but apparently this goes on all the time.
So there's what is basically a layered pattern of different types of UAVs that have made the Ukrainian battlefield relatively transparent. In other words, there are fixed wing drones that conduct intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. There are short range reconnaissance quadcopters. Most of them are commercial Chinese made products from DJI and other companies. There are FPV drones like the ones that you just saw in the video, which operate at a very short range, but could be very, very precise in how they attack and what they attack. And so all of those drones are looking down on the ground. All of those drones are trying to identify the targets. All of those drones have information that could be relayed to either attack drone crews or artillery or mortar units. In other words, anything that moves on the Ukrainian battlefield, or anyone for that matter, could be potentially tracked, identified, and then ultimately attacked. And so this is what this individual is describing. It's very difficult to move sometimes because the attack can come at any moment from any angle, because the battlefield could be seen through and through. It doesn't happen everywhere. It's a very long front, and some sections of the front are better equipped with drones than others. Obviously, some form of maneuver is still possible, such as the Ukrainian incursion into the Kursk region of Russia. But on balance, if we look at what's happening, for example, in eastern Ukraine, where there's a lot of warfare going on, it is not possible to mass your forces or mass equipment or mass vehicles and conduct maneuvers that were maybe possible prior to 2022. And so death is in the air at any given point. The whistling sound he described, that mosquito sound that increases in intensity as it gets closer, is the sound of an FPV drone. And so it is a very deadly sound. There's lots of videos out there of soldiers on both sides trying to evade and hide from that sound. It's actually very terrifying. It has a significant psychological impact on war. But again, the battlefield could be seen in ways that wasn't probably possible before. Add to that access to satellite imagery. And so data and information from drones of all types, from satellites, from aircraft, information from social media, all of that creates a relatively transparent picture of the battlefield where adversaries can be identified, they could be seen, they could be tracked, and ultimately attacked, sometimes many, many times in a row. So if one drone misses, another takes its place. This is happening against infantry, against dugouts, trenches, vehicles, tanks, and so on and so forth. And again, this is what is probably so unusual about this conflict.
And so let's look at the other half of this equation. So obviously for either side, they want to have offensive capability to do all the things you literally just mentioned. But then they also simultaneously have the defensive capabilities to either electronically warfare, knock them down, or physically, as we literally saw right there, he throwing his weapon at it. Now, we saw here a report, I only saw it in one place, so I really would like your view on this, that claims that in 2023, the Ukraine side had about 40% of their drones successfully made it through. 60% got shot down, but it's a numbers game, so that's probably a good number. But allegedly, this year, the Russian electronic warfare capacity, at least in the main, has gotten better. Now, maybe as few as 10% are getting through. Do you know anything about that? Is that accurate?
Yeah, both sides, if we read what they're talking about on social media platforms like Telegram, which has a lot of very useful tactical and daily information about conflict. I think both sides are basically saying that maybe 1 in 9 or 1 in 10 drones eventually get through. And there are multiple reasons for that. Number one is, of course, electronic warfare. Number two is friendly fires. Many units at the front do not really cooperate with each other and don't communicate well with each other. That is, they don't always alert units nearby that they are launching the drone and that the drone in the sky is friendly. And so if you see a drone above you in Ukraine, if you're a soldier in Ukraine, your number one rule is just to shoot it down. You don't think about whether it's friendly. But obviously, a lot of these electronic warfare fratricides happen, again, because of the lack of communication. And also, both sides now have significant knowledge and skill in tactical defense against these drones. So they're using small arms, they're using shotguns, they're using machine guns, they're using nets to protect their trenches and dugouts. They're using metal cages on armor and on stationary targets. So a lot of drones don't make it through. And then another reason why they don't necessarily hit the target is because of pilot error. There's no one common, let's say, program that teaches pilots on either side how to pilot these UAVs. Ukrainians have gotten a lot better at this, and they do have a program that is more or less unified when it comes to drone training. But a lot of such training is still done by volunteer private sector enterprises. And on the Russian side, probably the very bulk of pilot training is done by these volunteer efforts. And so not every pilot gets the same type of experience, not every pilot gets the same type of exposure. And so a lot of pilots do make errors when they're flying their drones. And finally, and this is certainly evident on the Russian side, of the many thousands of FPV drones and commercial quadcopters that they cobble together and send to the front, a lot of them suffer from poor quality. And that is, again, there's no common standard that dictates how these FPV drones are to be assembled. And some of that is sometimes also evident in Ukraine. And so a drone out of the box that is sent to Ukraine will not fly right away, or it will fly a couple hundred meters and fall down. So all of that basically adds up to, just like you said, maybe 10%, maybe a little more, maybe slightly less of UAVs actually hitting their targets. But yes, electronic warfare plays a very important role, and other factors like pilot error and the quality of the product also play a role as well.
Got it. Makes a lot of sense. Okay, let's look at one of the other advances or production, I guess, at least it's being talked about on the Russian side, and that is these wire-guided. Actually, I want to look at a different one, Gary, first. Is this wire-guided drones that come in that are like some of the tow missiles that we used back in my day. You can see that obviously these are high-quality video because it's going back literally on a string. So now this one is not subject to electronic warfare, as I understand. What do you see as the development of this? Is it something that could be a game changer in the drone category?
So most FPV drones, most quadcopters, most fixed-wing UAVs on both sides use radio channels. And those, of course, can be susceptible to electronic warfare jamming. And as I have just described, EW, electronic warfare, takes down a lot of these drones. A fiber optic cable that is unfolded behind the drone like a tow missile basically has all of the command and control communication and video feeds done through that fiber optic cable. So it's not susceptible to electronic warfare at all. Obviously, fiber optic enabled drones have their own advantages and disadvantages, right? The longer the distance you need to fly with a fiber optic cable, the bigger the spool, and therefore the larger the weight of the drone. The fiber optic enabled drones can't quite maneuver the same way as an FPV. They can't do the continuous circles above target. But as we have seen, they do provide very clear communication and video feed to target, so you can be sure that you can hit something. We're only at the beginning of the application of these particular drones. Russians started using them just a few weeks to a few months ago. Ukrainians also have them. This could be a potential game changer, but again, there are advantages and disadvantages to that UAV.
What would be the best way to defend against a wire-guided drone?
So I'm not exactly sure. Obviously, if you cut the fiber optic cable, then the drone is lost, because you lose not only the video feed, but you lose the control of the drone. If you're flying, or rather, if you're located in a very complex terrain that has, let's say, trees, buildings, things like that, then it's probably difficult for that drone to maneuver through because of the danger of getting a fiber optic cable entangled or even cut. Those drones are most capable in the open spaces, on roads, in the open fields, but probably in a very sophisticated environment, they could be less effective.
I see. Okay, moving to the next one here. What Gary was showing there again, this dragon's breath. This one looked the scariest to me, frankly, as someone who's been fighting, because I've seen what this kind of thermite can do when it's fall. I wonder if you could tell us. This is a relatively recent introduction onto the battlefield. Can you tell us a little bit about this?
So there's been about a dozen or so incidents of Ukraine using this particular drone. A lot of forces, a lot of soldiers, a lot of equipment could be hidden or camouflaged in forests or in any type of foliage. And so we see tons of videos of artillery systems or tanks, or again, soldiers and their positions located in large and small forests, which are spread throughout Ukraine. So taking out the foliage basically exposes those positions, those soldiers, and those systems. And that's why Ukraine is using the Thermite drone. It knows that Russian soldiers are located in these small forests. So Russians are trying to do the same. They're also trying to come up with their own solutions, and they're trying to copy Ukrainian example. But the video you're seeing right now is large sections of the forest are burnt out. So if there was any group of soldiers or equipment camouflaged there, they're probably going to be affected, attacked, and burnt out. It may chase them out of this forest to a more open area where they could be seen by other drones and attacked by other drones as well. So this is an important development. It's probably weather dependent, in the sense that in the late spring, summer, and early fall, when there's a lot of foliage, you need those drones. In the fall and in the winter, when there are no leaves essentially on trees, it becomes a different story, and these drones are probably less effective because people and equipment can't hide in the forest quite as easily.
Got it. Okay, want to move to a different one here. So here is something in a private sector, in a civilian sector. These swarm drones, so-called. Disney uses them, for example, to have nice little shows over the ground. This one here, these are little drones that are all flying in formation and doing little happy little things here. Here's something from apparently a Chinese source, not quite so benign or happy. Gary, if you can show that other one up there. This is actually more of a question. Is this the future of drones, where it literally could saturate an area in here? And what is the military risk of these, and how susceptible? Well, sorry, I'm asking too many questions. First of all, what is the risk of this kind of drone warfare showing up in the Russian-Ukraine war?
Well, swarm applications have been discussed prior to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Swarm applications have been discussed basically from the beginning. Now that there are thousands of different types of UAVs in the air, it is a logical decision to connect them together in a swarm. There are, in fact, swarm research and development efforts taking place on both sides. It is a very concerning development because swarms can overwhelm air defenses. They can saturate air defenses. They can overwhelm any type of defense arrayed against them, especially if the swarm has hundreds or perhaps thousands of members. But we don't have that yet. It's very difficult to actually use that type of technology in a Ukrainian environment that's teeming with all kinds of countermeasures, such as electronic warfare, such as kinetic technologies. We haven't seen the application of military drones like in this Chinese video, but suffice it to say that lots of militaries and lots of countries are looking at this as a logical extension of the type of drone technologies they're witnessing right now. And especially if that is combined with commercial type developments and successes in artificial intelligence technologies that can guide these swarms to targets and allow swarm members to communicate amongst each other, communicate back to the operators on the ground, to select targets, to exchange data about the targets. that could be quite concerning. For now, this is still in the research and experimentation phase. We're seeing a lot of that in Hollywood, obviously, but we're not yet seeing that in Ukraine. But probably both sides are concerned that there could be a potential technological breakthrough that would allow swarms to be activated and used. And this would be a very different and very dangerous phase of the war if that were to happen.
And what about the prospect that I've heard some of that using some of this AI technology, that some of the drones, aside from the wire guided ones, which can't be interdicted, but they also have optical view to where they have the target programmed in, so it's not doesn't have to communicate with back channels, but will go on the ground basically autonomously up to its target. Have you seen much of that so far?
We're starting to see that in Ukraine, first from Ukraine itself, and then developments from Russia, again on a very limited basis. But this is basically the target lock, target and image recognition technology, which recognizes a specific shape as a preloaded target data. Communication is sent back to the operator to approve that strike. And once the operator approves the strike, then the drone flies the target on its own without communicating with the operator. Again, making electronic warfare against this drone rather useless at that point. And that's also another concerning development. And so there's a technological race in Ukraine for a more sophisticated target recognition and target lock technology, for more sophisticated machine vision technology that would enable these drones to operate more or less independently and more or less autonomously, assuming there's still a human in the loop who can approve the target. And that's an important distinction here. It's interesting that in years prior to its invasion of Ukraine, Russian military and defense establishment were talking about warfare as a natural extension of existing technologies that would evolve into more or less autonomous technologies, where humans would be located very, very far from combat and would essentially just approve strikes with those systems operating more or less independently. That's theory. And there's obviously a huge gap between Russian theory of autonomous warfare and what they're actually doing in Ukraine. But there's a lot of development in different types of autonomy, which is enabled by commercial applications. Lots of what you're seeing in the video, lots of what you're showing right now is actually enabled by commercial technologies. Not all of the drones flying in Ukraine on both sides actually come from defense industrial enterprises. The bulk of those drones are actually commercial UAVs, which were purchased by volunteer communities, which were purchased by startups, and were donated to either side. And so commercial technology application and the evolution of commercial tech is actually driving the success of drone technology and is driving the evolution of drone use in Ukraine for both sides.
Wow, that's absolutely fascinating, actually. Is the drone warfare just a numbers game right now? Because from one report I saw just a couple of days ago, apparently Russia is now producing drones throughout all sources, somewhere around 100,000 per month. And I've heard that the Ukraine side may be similar to that. I haven't heard any actual numbers on, but clearly both sides have prioritized this as a necessary component on the front line here. How is it going to be determined which side succeeds in this? Is it truly just whichever one can make the most?
Numbers definitely are very important, but large drone numbers that are available don't necessarily equal to the actual drone strikes, right? We just discussed that only 1 in 10 of, let's say, FPV drones, or maybe 1 in 9, make it through. And that, of course, depends on technology itself, the quality of the drones, how they're assembled, who they're assembled by. It depends on the skill of a drone pilot and the drone operator. So it is very important to consider how the pilot is taught. And obviously, the countermeasures which are used against these drones are also very, very important. Just last month, Russian Defense Minister Belousov said that 4,000 drones are available to Russian military every day. So that means, according to him, that Russian military has access to 120,000 drones. Most of these, of course, are FPVs, first-person view, light tactical short-range UAVs, but there's probably other fixed-wing ISR drones and maybe others that he was considering. There are lots of volunteer efforts on both sides. which manufacture a very, very large number of UAVs. And so for Ukrainians, it could be anywhere between 50 to 100,000 manufactured a month. For Russians, that number varies wildly, anywhere from 100,000 to maybe as high as 300,000 by some Ukrainian estimates. But again, just because these drones could be assembled doesn't mean that all of them are going to be used. In fact, a much smaller number is going to be used because of quality issues. And of those that are actually used, very small number is going to get through because of electronic warfare, air defense systems, other defenses, pilot error, and so on and so forth. So the numbers do matter, and Ukrainians aim to manufacture 1 million FPV drones per year. Russians can probably do the same, but those numbers have to be considered in light of how many are actually used, by whom, and how many are actually making it through.
Got it. So what is the future of drone warfare as you see it, based on what you've seen so far? Or maybe a better question is, what's next?
So it's important to consider how this conflict is viewed by major powers, certainly by the United States, by China, and by others. So cheap, attritable, expendable mass application of UAVs is certainly going to be on the agenda. And the United States is moving in that direction. It has a replicator program that aims to manufacture and field a large number of one-way attack drones. Other countries are looking at what Ukraine has done, what Russia has done, and are trying to copy that as well. So we may see mass-scale application of remote-controlled piloted UAVs. We may see an application and use of autonomous and semi-autonomous UAVs. We may even see fiber optic enabled drones. We're going to see an increased use of one-way attack drones, the ones that Russia launches against Ukraine and the ones that Ukraine launches against Russia with increasing success and frequency. And so these are cheap drones that cost probably anywhere between $100,000 or $120,000, maybe even less, that can fly up to 1,000, maybe 1,500 or even more kilometers, which are manufactured in large numbers and used in large numbers against aerial targets, ground targets, against air defenses, or anything that has been identified as a target. These are the patterns that we're witnessing in Ukraine right now. Not all of those patterns may survive the war. Not all of those patterns may survive technology that is arrayed in defense against these drones, right? Because it's basically a point counterpoint type of war. For every drone development, there's a counter UAV development. There's an electronic warfare development. So some of these drone developments may be met with very sophisticated air defenses and counter drone defenses. But again, the patterns that are visible in Ukraine today are already dictating how other conflicts are unfolding, because other conflicts are also using cheap, attritable quadcopters, FPV drones, and fixed-wing drones. And patterns seen in Ukraine are going to impact how forces fight on the ground, how they're massing, how they're maneuvering, how they're moving around. It will impact logistics. It will impact electronic warfare. It will impact the development of air defenses, in-depth and layered, and so on and so forth.
Wow, truly, it is kind of a comprehensive game changer for the nature of warfare for anyone who engages in it going into the future. That's for sure.
Right, but it's also important to note, obviously, we're not getting rid of piloted aircraft anytime soon, because no drone can carry as much or can be quite as powerful as a manned aircraft or even a helicopter. But we are witnessing, for example, in tactical engagements, helicopters can be shut down by drones, and Russia lost several helicopters to FPV drones, right? Mm-hmm. A multi-million-dollar system was lost to something that cost just around $1,000. So patterns of war are going to be impacted, and certainly how we're using manned and uncrewed and unmanned assets together in a combination are going to evolve rather rapidly following this conflict.
Got it. And so as we wrap up here, can it be said that one side is winning the drone war? How do you see that?
I think if you look at how both sides in this war are talking about this conflict, they're not necessarily saying that one side is winning. I think they're looking at this in terms of a technological race, that as soon as one side has an advantage, the other side learns very quickly, develops countermeasures, or copies that advantage. So it's very difficult to win in this type of race. And of course, with so many technologies, with so many inventions going to the front on a daily basis, again, it's an ongoing technological race. And this is probably a better way to identify this conflict rather than say who's actually winning.
Wow, that's fascinating. It's listen, we are so grateful for you coming on today. This has been very, very illuminating. One of the more interesting shows that we've actually put on this channel. So we really appreciate you coming on, and thank you.
Thanks for having me.
And we thank you guys for watching too. And again, wow, this is some fantastic stuff you're getting here on Daniel Davis Deep Dive, and we're going to keep giving it to you. Appreciate you guys. Be sure and follow us now. We're on podcasting there, because a lot of people I know can't do video. They don't have time for that, or they don't have the opportunity, but they still want to follow Daniel Davis Deep Dive. Be sure, and anywhere you get your podcast, Spotify, Apple Podcast, iHeartRadio, just type in Daniel Davis Deep Dive and you will find us there. Thank you very much. Look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.